just a brief background about the organization I work for, the Phoenix Conservancy. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. Our mission is to restore endangered ecosystems all around the world, both for communities that depend on them and also, of course, to conserve biodiversity. The main focus we have when doing that is that we think it's really important to work with the local communities in these endangered ecosystems, because we find that, if you don't coordinate and work with local communities, it really doesn't work well. And we were founded in Pullman in 2016 by a WSU alum, and we started as a volunteer-based organization, but we've grown pretty quickly since then. And we've got a nice, modest-sized team that works with us. That's really awesome. Today, I'm going to focus, of course, on the Palouse Prairie, but just to note, we also work in other endangered ecosystems. Right now, we also work in South Dakota in the Great Plains and in a rainforest or humid forest in Madagascar called Ivoire. And just to quickly cover what we mean by restoration, we don't mean, taking it back to some historic state. What we mean by restoration is just restoring the ecosystem to a healthy, functional state. So, in really simple terms, what we mean by that is just we want it to be relatively stable with pretty high native biodiversity. We want all those rich plants and animals and everything back there as much as possible. And just, we just want it to get to a state where we're not massively losing a bunch of species. So essentially, by restoration, we just mean we're getting the environment to a state where it has time to adapt and recover. Probably a lot of folks here either live in the Palouse Prairie or live close to the Palouse Prairie. The Palouse region obviously is relatively big. So historically, Palouse Prairie covered the whole Palouse region. So basically all the way from, sort of south of Spokane over into northern Idaho, down pretty much to the Snake, and then, over a little bit to the west. And this prairie is really interesting because it's unique in a lot of different ways, namely in that it has really high flower cover. So a lot of prairies are pretty predominantly bunch grasses. Palouse Prairie is really interesting because it has a lot of flowers. And also it's because of where it's situated geographically, it's pretty isolated from most of the prairies in North America, which is like the Great Plains that essentially stretch up from Canada all through the central US down to Texas. So it's really interesting and really important to protect. Of course, folks that have lived here for a while or are familiar with the history here, this is the case with a lot of different prairie ecosystems across North America. It's what has made them some of the most endangered ecosystems around the globe. They have really rich soils, which happen to be really good for farming, which is awesome because it supports our local economy. Obviously, it feeds us, which is so important. But unfortunately, because of this big agricultural boom, it led to severe losses in Palouse Prairie. So we have very little left, less than 1%, people estimate. And the remnants that we do have are pretty few and far between. And a lot of them, unfortunately, have been degraded mostly by invasive weeds. Just to showcase how beautiful native Palouse Prairie is, here are some of my favorite photos from places like Steptoe, Kamiak. This in particular, I think, is Steptoe. Here's another Steptoe photo. Like, it's just, the amount of flowers is just gorgeous. And obviously with the rolling hills in the background. And then, of course, some of what I'm really excited to showcase today are all these beautiful native flowers that we have living here. This in particular is sticky geranium. I'm not really going to talk about it more today, but it's in the photo and it's beautiful. In the background, you can see arrowleaf balsam root, which I'm also not going to feature today, but I feel like a lot of folks kind of know this one. It's iconic to the West in general. And Here's an example of not a remnant prairie, but our oldest restoration site. It's in town in Pullman. It's at Pine Ridge Apartments. It's maybe 5 or 6 years old at this point, and you can just see how gorgeous it looks on the hillside. So I'm going to talk more about my our suggested guidelines for native landscaping, or the tips and tricks. But first, I want to focus on the why. So native landscaping is awesome because it plays two dual roles here. Not only is it important to support our endangered ecosystem and all the awesome animals and other wildlife that live there, but it also offers some really big benefits for landowners and for our communities. This is, just a few that I'm going to feature here. There are many, but for example, native plants are really good at promoting soil health. So we've got a big erosion problem here in the Palouse. Native plants have really deep roots that I'll talk a little bit more about later that help with soil stability. They prevent erosion. They basically nurture the native soil biome. So, supporting, for example, really high microbial diversity that makes soil healthy. Planting native plants also supports more diverse pollinators, which I'll also talk about later. That's great if you have a garden or you grow crops that need insect pollination services. They also attract native pest biocontrols. For example, a big one here is parasitic wasps. I know wasps can seem scary to some people. Mostly we just notice the really annoying ones like yellow jackets, but there are a lot of wasps that are tiny and we never notice that play a really important role in preventing pests, for example, on crops. So if you attract those, you can help prevent pests. And then our native plants, once they're actually there, they're generally pretty resilient, at least if they're in the habitat they're supposed to be in. So they're low maintenance. They do a great job of outcompeting weeds once they're established. They also provide services like helping filter water better and requiring less water overall. Like once they're established, you usually hardly have to water them, if at all. They help with mitigating natural disasters like floods and fires. And then finally, they also add value for our communities. So, we've got some pretty good tourism with places like Steptoe Butte or visiting for sports games. Having more outdoor green spaces that are great for recreation or tourism can really add a lot of value to our community. Growing certain native plants can provide supplemental income, like for example, with maybe you sell flowers or grow medicinals or extra food, native crops, things like that, for example. And here's one of my favorite examples of a restoration we did in someone's backyard in Pullman. They had a severe soil erosion problem, and by planting native plants, we're able to stabilize the soil. This is only 1 year, I think, after we first installed, and it's already looking really good. Things kind of grow and fill in over time. So that's sort of the why. Obviously, the big question for a lot of folks is like, how? Because our ecosystem is so endangered, because there's not much of it here, because resources can be limited or tricky to use, or knowledge can sometimes be hard to come by. I'm going to share some guidelines for how to kind of start to go about using native forbs and grasses in your landscape that hopefully will be helpful. And along the way, I'll feature some of our favorites as they pertain to different tips. There are quite a lot of different native species, so it's just a few I'm showcasing. These are just examples, but hopefully this gives folks a better idea of how to kind of approach this. So the first big tip is that it's really important to match native forbs and grasses you choose with the conditions that your site has. For example, if you've got part of your yard you want to plant some natives in, it's in full sun, it's rocky, it's maybe a little bit harsh. That flower in the middle, something like Wyeth's buckwheat. They're super sturdy. They love full sun. That plant is going to do really well in a space like that. If you've got somewhere maybe a little bit wetter, maybe a little bit cooler, on the left there, oh goodness, Douglas's, maybe I should have put plant names here. Grass widow there on the left is a really good option for sites like that. On the right there, you probably won't find the species commercially available, but I thought it was a really good example of a more specialist plant. This is ballhead waterleaf. It's a really cool wildflower that likes to grow in sort of shady, crappy soil slopes. And it really depends heavily on having a nice snow melt that really saturates the ground in spring, and then the sites dry the rest of the year. So it really depends on the species. Some have really specific requirements. Some can kind of do a good job in lots of different spaces, but knowing what those habitat requirements are is obviously really important for having a successful native plant garden or incorporating them into your landscape. The second big tip I have is to take advantage of natural succession, and I'll explain that a little bit more. So when ecosystems, like say prairies, when places are recovering from heavy disturbance, like for example, there's a big fire, there are certain species that are really good at growing in those disturbed, crappy conditions. They love it, they thrive in it, they grow really quickly. It's really important to include those in your plantings or if you use a seed mix so that early on you can have that nice quick growth to kind of get things going and, you know, quickly start to fill in space against weeds and start some of these processes that are important for the other stuff to kind of establish. So we make sure to include what we call pioneer species or trooper species in our restoration mixes. These are, I'll give some examples in a moment, but these are species that they're kind of like generalists, which means they can grow in a pretty wide range of conditions. And they're just like tough as nails. This is often species that germinate really quickly. So if you know what a winter stratification is, just means that some seeds need to overwinter with like cold, wet soil until they actually can germinate. This is often species that don't need that, so they grow pretty much right away as soon as water is available. And these are often annual species or species that spread through lateral roots in the soil, so rhizomatous, or like they seed really quickly. Oftentimes, these species are also cheaper to purchase. So especially when it comes to seeds, you can get a lot more seeds of most of these types of species, or at least some, for less money. So that also helps a lot. Here's some examples of how it might look in the beginning. Over on the left, this is actually the same yard, but over on the left, this is an example of yarrow germination after a spring installation. You can see how this is maybe a couple months after. You can see how quickly and densely that yarrow starts to fill in. We often use this one for paths or like native lawn substitutes, but it's a really good pioneer species. It's tough, it's hardy, it's not picky, and it grows really quickly. Same is true of this species on the right. This is blanket flower. You can see here it went crazy. This is not what the landscape is going to look like in the long run. It's just that this is sort of, we like to use to our advantage that natural succession, sort of those stages when it comes to restoration. And you can see like this one grew really quickly, filled in, there's blooms everywhere. I think it's beautiful. And that way you can get things started and keep the weeds out until the rest of the plants can establish. Another example is Clarkia. This one is expensive to get seeds of, so maybe not super approachable, but I wanted to mention it because annuals can do a great job at this. They're, again, tough, they grow quickly, they make these beautiful flower patches, and this one is an annual. And then this one is a good option for shadier, more woody spots. This is large-leaved avens. It grows a lot in understories, grows quickly, great for pollinators. I do want to say a big caveat with this one. We have an invasive that looks very much like it It's a close relative. So if you've seen something like this in your yard, it's really important to check whether it's the invasive or the native. And honestly, with these ones, unless you're experienced with plant ID, it's really good to just ask an expert. But I wanted to give an example of one that thrives in shade. And then this should be 3, not 2, but the next big thing that's important to focus on is making sure you choose a nice diverse array of species. So diverse phenologies, which is just a fancy way of saying timing of things. Usually when I refer to phenology, I mean like they bloom at different times, and I'll explain that in a second. They have lots of different structures. So taller ones, shorter ones, flowers that are long, flowers that are short, and lots of different colors. But this can pretty much apply to any trait that might be important for wildlife. In sciencey terms, we call this functional diversity. So if you have high functional diversity in your landscape, it just means you have lots of different plants or animals that fulfill a lot of different roles or jobs. So you can think of it kind of like if you have a team at work and like they've got a job to do, right? But you've got different people on the team that specialize in different things. You can do a lot better at like doing better work or getting the job done. So that's kind of how this works. This is great for both wildlife and also for people. So I mentioned having the diverse phenologies or timings of things. So for example, picking different flowers that bloom at different times of the year. This is also really good for wildlife that eat or otherwise use the plants. And for example, could attract a variety of different biocontrols. So, things that eat pests. So you've got different types of biocontrols that eat different types of pests, and then that helps keep them off your landscape or your crops. And also improves resiliency to natural disasters. So you might have some species that are really good at surviving drought. You might have other species that are really good at surviving severe frost. So that way, if you have one of those disasters, everything doesn't die. Maybe like one thing might die or 2 things, but that way your landscape is really resilient. For example, just to showcase functional diversity when it comes to flower shapes and colors, I guess. This is a hawk moth, also called a sphinx moth. They have really long tongues. So they specialize on flowers with really long nectaries, which is essentially just that tubular part. So like having long flowers can help support moths like that. Some bees with longer tongues, like sort of medium flowers. Bees with shorter tongues can do shorter things. And then I'll talk more about other types of pollinators too. Other things with short tongues like flies or beetles also prefer shallower flowers. But however you shake it, flower structure, flower color, different families of flowers, the more diversity you have, usually the better. Here's just an example of different species that bloom, all the way around the year. So you're really extending the period of time that you have flowers blooming in your yard. There is at least one winter species there. It's not super common. You probably can't buy it. But Lomatium gormanii, it's Gorman's biscuit root. It blooms in like January or December sometimes. That one's kind of an outlier, and then we've also got Mertensia longiflora, bluebells on that upper right-hand quadrant there. That one's an early spring bloomer. We've got species like blanket flower that I mentioned earlier that bloom in the summer. And then I'm about to go over some different fall bloomers, which are usually the most important to focus on because they often, or at least sometimes, get missed in restoration or garden mixes with native plants. Here are some examples of early spring bloomers. The far left and far right species are, again, probably not something you can purchase, but I wanted to showcase them. But the one in the middle, Lomatium, this is another kind of biscuit root related to that winter blooming one that I mentioned earlier. This is a really good species that blooms really early in the season, so really good for pollinators. That one is all different types of Lomatium are really good to include in your mixes. Some bloom a little earlier than others, but that's just an example of a more readily available one that's an early spring bloomer. Usually when it comes to fall bloomers, species in the sunflower family are really good often for fall blooms. I know that we're WSU-ish area, but purple and gold are usually the fall colors. So purple asters, like the one on the right, like Jessica's aster is the one on the bottom right. We've also got one in the same genus called Western Mountain Aster. Those are great fall bloomers, super sturdy, relatively easy to grow. On the left there is a goldenrod. We've got Missouri goldenrod and Canada goldenrod. Those are also really great fall bloomers. They're tough, they're sturdy. Also a trooper species like the pioneers I mentioned earlier, easy to grow. These are examples of native species you can include in your landscape to really extend those fall blooms. And then this is just more because I just like nerding out about bugs or bees or pollinators, but I wanted to showcase some examples of different sizes of pollinators that like different types of flowers. So like the super tiny one you can see on the right, this is a kind of sweat bee. It's tiny, it needs flowers that are also shallow and more readily available. The one on the left here is an orchard bee, blue orchard bee. They have longer tongues. They like that penstemon over there that's got the longer nectary. There are not too many red flowers here, but I wanted to showcase Scarlet Gilia, which is, you can see this plant over on the right. It's also a little bit hard to come by, but if you can find it, it is just gorgeous. Usually small amounts of seeds. Sometimes they're available from local seed suppliers. It's just beautiful. And red also happens to be a color that really attracts hummingbirds. Not super common in the region, but I feel like we all love hummingbirds. And you can see those nectaries are just about the right length for the beak to get in there. Folks often talk about monarch butterflies, which are important. So milkweeds are good for those, but I wanted to showcase another type of butterfly and a plant that's good for it. This is the anise swallowtail butterfly. Its caterpillars only feed on Lomatium, so biscuit roots. So I've already mentioned these a couple times. You can tell I really like this plant. So they cannot reproduce without this plant. So including this plant would support this specific butterfly. Folks often think of bees and butterflies when they think of pollinators. So I just wanted to showcase that beetles and actually some flies, wasps also, these are also really important pollinators. And generally for beetles and flies, good rule of thumb is that they tend to like shallow flowers. So you can see here, both of these flowers are pretty readily available for these beetles. I don't know, I think they're cute. I know people don't love flies, but their hoverflies are really important pollinators. So I just quick wanted to showcase those two. They also like shallow flowers. On the right here, you can see this one's on, I'm pretty sure, a Lomatium. The one on the left is on I'm pretty sure that's bindweed, which is not good. It's invasive, but this is a photo I had. So these often get mistaken for bees, these flies, but they're also really important pollinators. And my next tip is to source locally adapted seeds and plants whenever possible. Not always possible, but I just wanted to showcase that we do in the Palouse have some species that are pretty widely distributed, so they're not just found in the Palouse. Sometimes they're found over a really big area. This is not a Western example, but for example, this one species, you can see these sort of like different, what we might call ecotypes or different populations or groups of populations. These are very different places. So for example, that upland ecotype in blue would be way more cold tolerant, whereas the lowland and the coastal ecotypes probably don't do so well in cold. So it's really important, if at all possible, to make sure that the seeds and plants that you're buying are locally adapted, at least to this general region. The more local, the better. I gotta have myself there. Again, not always possible, but when it is, it's super helpful. They just perform better because they're used to this type of climate. Here's just a summary. This is not my figure, but here's some of the pros and cons of using actual native species. Well, I guess wild ecotypes is a good way to put it versus cultivars. So oftentimes nurseries will sell what they call native cultivars. They're bred to act a little bit more like normal garden plants, which can have some benefits, but on the downside, they're usually not as well adapted to the local climate, and they might not support like pollinators or other native wildlife as well as the native ecotypes or wild ecotypes. So another really important consideration. Another big thing that I think is, this one's probably one of the most important we find when working with folks. It's really important to understand the natural cycles and just generally be patient when working with native plants, especially if you're restoring any significantly sized area. And what I mean by this is that, first off, when you install, it's going to be most convenient to essentially either plant or seed or both with those natural cycles when plants would normally be starting to grow. So for example, fall is the best time really because the rains are a little bit more reliable. You can also do it in spring though. That tends to be a good time. We often find, especially for spring planting or spring seeding, it's really important to irrigate through that first summer just because it's getting drier. The spring rains are not always super reliable. Summers get really hot. So if you do have plants already planted or seeds already germinating, watering them through that first summer at least can be really helpful. After that, it's not so important. If you're seeding, just note that a lot of different seeds need that overwintering cycle that I mentioned earlier. It's really important to be patient when you're, oftentimes, when we put the restorations in, it's like, it seems like not much is happening at first. It's kind of underwhelming and you're kind of worried, like, did they die? What's happening? That's totally normal. Our prairie plants really invest in their roots before shoots. I have an example of that in a second. So they take some time. We call it the sleep, creep, leap. It's like year one, everything's kind of sleeping, not much is happening. Creep is year two, leap is year three, where it really kicks off. This does depend on some different environmental factors, like how much water there is, if you've got severe erosion problems. And then finally, we find it's really important. I know it's really hard. I know it's really time costly. If you're restoring a big area, spending more time upfront on weed control can go a really long way in making everything way lower maintenance in the long run. It's usually the first year or two where there's a really big weed bounce back. If you are making sure that you have enough timing, labor, materials to deal with that, if you're doing a big area, it really goes a long way to making sure that you have more efficiency and success in the long run. Here's an example of that sleep, creep, leap. You can see like more weeds in the beginning. Native plants are like, what are they doing? And then year two, everything's kind of starting to move. Year three is when it really kicks off there. I mentioned that roots before shoots happens. You can see why here. So this is an example of, I think, a sunflower maybe that we had in our greenhouse. Look how tiny the top of that plant is, and then look at the root system. I mean, like, if you just looked at the top, you would think nothing's happening, but underground, they're doing a lot of work. And one consideration I'll just sort of glaze over is if you're doing a big landscape, we really like to cluster things together. Planting a bunch of the same plant in one area so that as they grow in, the landscape looks more mature faster. That's like a really nice tip that we've been starting to use more. And then finally, we have this probably seems really overwhelming for someone just getting into it. There's a lot to consider. It's really important to take advantage of all the awesome local resources we have. That's things like, if you need more information, you want to learn about more plants, our native growers and suppliers or neighbors that really like planting native, they're going to be awesome resources for this. We've got Rose Creek and Plants of the Wild are some of our favorite native nurseries here. They are awesome. If you go and you want to buy some plants or buy some seeds, they can often, help advise at least to some extent, or at least provide you with some materials that might be helpful. Of course, our conservation districts are also great sources of information. So whoever your local conservation district is, if it's Palouse CD or one of the other ones, they often have really great educational materials. Native Plant Societies, Palouse Prairie Foundation have awesome informational materials online, and I'm sure they've got other sort of physical packets maybe. And then any other online resources like Burke or Barium, educational events like this one you can go to. These are all really good places to learn more. Sometimes for bigger projects, it's too much to do by yourself. So if you're in a situation like that, conservation districts have really great programs for helping out with that, for assistance, whether it's with, resources or possibly, some labor or volunteering. And then the same thing goes for us, the Phoenix Conservancy. We do a lot of invasive weed control. We've got a native landscaping program. So if you're able to afford those resources, or if you're interested in maybe getting assistance with those things, feel free to get in touch with us. And finally, I always like to end with a call for action. Plant native plants. No one's going to be like amazing at it at first, but following those general guidelines and asking for help, whatever you do, it's really helpful. Supporting our local growers, connecting with local conservation orgs like you're doing right now, get involved with your community, donate, volunteer if you're able to, and of course, spread the word. And that's it for me. Thanks everyone for listening. These are just some of our partners we work with that I want to acknowledge. Here's some awesome members from our team. Yeah, and thanks so much for listening.
Awesome. Thank you, Shannon. That was really great information. Thank you for kicking it off. Loved learning about all the flowers and seeing all the beautiful photos you guys are taking. We are going to hand it off now to Lauren. And Shannon, if you wouldn't mind just, taking your screen down. And then Lauren, whenever you're ready, we're ready for you to begin your part of the presentation as well. Thank you again, Shannon.
Oh, I should probably unmute myself. For how many Zoom meetings I've done in my lifetime, I should probably always remember to unmute myself. Well, yeah, Shannon, thank you so much for that information. Amazing place, or amazing information of how we can get started. I will attempt to follow up with just as good of information, and help you guys enhance your landscape with native plants. So some of this might be a little bit repetitive. Mine's a little bit more of an overview because Shannon did a great job at going in depth. But if there's any questions or if there's anything that you want me to talk about further, we can always talk about it at the end. So here we go. Just kidding. There we go. So what do I mean by native plants? You got a beautiful definition of Palouse Prairie a couple minutes ago, but when I say native plants, I mean Palouse Prairie native plants. So plants that have historically thrived and occupied this area. Now it depends on what literature you read, but typically we like to say that the Palouse Prairie region extends up to the northern forest of Idaho down to the Snake River. Where you go east to west, that depends on who you're reading. But typically, we like to say that we're kind of in that heart of that Palouse Prairie ecosystem. Through just human evolution and development, the Palouse Prairie has less than 1% remaining intact. So keeping these natives and utilizing them in our landscapes, using them in urban settings is so important because it creates habitat connectivity. So it allows our animals and our insects and our birds to have shorter jumps from each pocket to pocket. Another reason that we love to use these native plants is that they're acclimated to this area. They've thrived here for years and years. They've dealt with our seasonal fluctuations. They know our soil. So having these plants in your garden or in your yard or on your property is really nice because it will establish really well and last you a really long time. And then the last reason we want to use our native plants is to prevent species extinction and endangerment. So Palouse Prairie is an endangered ecosystem, and that means that the plants within it that create that ecosystem are at risk of facing extinction or endangerment. A couple species like our Spalding's catchfly are on the endangered list, but a lot of amazing organizations such as U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Palouse Conservation Soil District, Phoenix Conservancy, and us have been working to restore it. But by you putting native plants in your landscape, by putting it in your yard, we're able to increase those populations. We're able to help increase genetic diversity and even maybe potentially help with seed collection. So very important, or it's just a great overall feeling to use our native species. So Shannon took a very good approach to like grasses and forbs. Mine's going to be a little bit more riparian, but it's also going to focus on trees and shrubs. So I'm going to I'm going to look at how I'm planning a planting kind of from like a larger scale. And that's not to say that these techniques can't be used at a smaller scale, because I used it for my own yard. But yeah, just when I start to think about a planting plan, this is kind of how I go. So things that I want to know before I pick out my plants for my list are soil type, water availability, and depth to restrictive barrier. So the first one is soil type, and that's just, what is our soil made of? Is it made of clay? Is it made of silt? Is it made of loam? Like, what is comprising what's underneath the ground? Is it nutrient deficient? Does it have an acidic pH? What's going on underground? How can I use this to pick out my plants? The second is water availability. So I want to know either how close my water table is to the surface, or where it's at in my soil horizons. Or I want to take a look inside and say, can I take the time to create this irrigation system to plant these plants where they need to go? So those are two things I look at for water availability. And the last one is depth to restrictive barrier. We have amazing soils, as Shannon pointed out, but we also do have pockets of basalt, really thick clay, things that roots have a hard time getting through. And so when we look at depth to restrictive barrier, we want to see where it is in the soil horizons, because if it's at 20 inches, if it's at 10 inches, those roots, when they're young, are going to have a really hard time getting through that. So we want to look for places where our roots can thrive underneath, because these native plants have extremely hardy root systems, as you just saw. So those are the three main things that I'm looking at. The main tool that I use is called Web Soil Survey. It is a NRCS tool. It's fantastic. Some of the soil data is a little old, so take it with a grain of salt, but it is a really great place to start. And I'll show a little bit more in the next slide. The second one is the USDA Plant Hardiness Zone map. This is just a really great one to identify I guess it's one to refer to, because oftentimes when you look at plants, they'll say USDA Hardy Zone 2 or 8. And these are just telling you where their climatic preferences are. So you want to make sure that the plants that you're planting in your area match their ability to withstand the climate averages and lows and highs. Just for reference, most of Pullman is in 6A or 6B. So we're nice in the middle. And then soil test kits. I don't have a certain preference on a soil test kit, because I have a wonderful team at PCD that tests my soil for me, which we love them for that. But I have seen a lot on gardening websites, on Home Depot, Amazon, things like that. For more, for better knowledge of a solid soil test kit, I would definitely ask some more expertise, maybe some of our nurseries. We have a great master gardener program here. You could definitely ask them for recommendations on that. Okay, brief and look into the web soil survey. So like I said, I use this for my home. So before we built our home, I looked up to see what our soil looks like. And when you put in your address, it'll come up with this little area. And over here, it gives you the different soils that you have on your property. And once you click into them, it gives you this nice little description over here on, can you guys see my mouse? Sorry, am I just, okay, good. Okay, great. So you'll get this nice description over here. So the main things that I want to look at is what's my parent material. We have loess and some volcanic ash, fantastic. And then we have our silt loams and our silty clay loams. So that's good to know because some of these plants have pretty strict preferences. I then look at my depth to restrictive barrier. I've lost my mouse, there it is. And it's more than 80 inches, fantastic. I can plant my yearling saplings without being worried that they're just going to jeer root up after the first couple of years. I feel comfortable with them developing those hardy root systems that can break through that. Drainage class, that's a huge one. So we want to make sure that we know how our soil drains when it comes to water. A lot of these trees and shrubs prefer a well-drained, and that just means that your soil isn't completely just saturated and holding water. We want it to be moist, but we don't want it to just sit there. So having nice drainage, having nice storage underneath into those soil horizons is really important. And then frequency of flooding, frequency of ponding, no, that's great. And then when I look, the last thing I want to look at is my depth to water table, more than 80 inches. So if I have a plant that is really dependent on having access to that water table, I'm kind of out of luck because it's pretty deep down there and I don't want to dig down there. So we will remember that coming or going forward. Okay, so those are things that I pull off my web soil survey. Happy to go through this with anyone if they ever want to reach out. YouTube has tons of great videos about it, describing how to use it and everything. Really recommend using this as you go forward with your planning. Okay, so we've done our research. We're ready to plant. We've used all of our knowledge to pick out what plants we want to plant. My first piece of advice is to make sure you have a good base. Shannon went super into depth with this, which is so great because you want to make sure that you get rid of your weeds, spend time doing that, and just making sure that you have either, you know, that solid grass base or using those pioneer species that she was talking about so that your soil is a safe haven for these other trees and shrubs that are a little bit more finicky. The second one for making sure you have a good base is attempting to prevent rodent and mammal predation. So if you're like me, you have everything in the world trying to eat your plants. So you have deers and rodents and rabbits and everything. So definitely try to be proactive with this. One thing that I use personally and that we use at PCD is an organic plant skid. It's a granular repellent that utilizes a mixture of, I think it's like urine, like animal urine and blood and all that icky stuff that animals just don't want to go near. But it's a great way to it's a great way to deter underground predation because you can put it in the hole and it won't affect the roots. Other practices that I've heard is you can put essential oils such as mint or rosemary that deter them. I've heard castor oil. I've never tried castor oil, but apparently that helps. And then I've also heard garlic. So those are some things that you can put in the ground that kind of help prevent those guys from snagging the roots. And then up top, a tree tube is fantastic. Chicken wire just around it. So those stems are nicely protected. Next up is identifying your planting timeline. Once you have your plant list, you should see when they prefer to be planted in spring or fall. That is typically the 2 times that you should plant because we get the most rainfall. So just refer to your plant's preferences when you do that. And then proper planting techniques. You want to avoid J-rooting and the pole test. So J-rooting is more specific to if you buy plants from the tree sale. The plants that come from our tree sale are going to be bare root. So unlike when you go to the store and you have soil nicely around those root systems, they're going to come just as a root system, like in this picture here. Well, hopefully not like that. That's a J-root, but nice and straight. But when you do that, sometimes people will think, oh, well, I can just, dig a decent sized hole and put it down there, and then my roots will kind of grow like they do in a pot. No, we want to make the hole as long as the roots because we want them facing downwards. We don't want them to kind of start going back up and get exposed to the elements. So make sure that your hole is as deep as the root system. You want to get the root collar just around the base of the stem, nice and covered. So, yeah. And then the pole test. I always do this with my plants. You should get your plant nice and tight into your hole. So you want to really pad in that dirt around those root systems. And at the end, give it a little pull. Nothing too hard, nothing like a, Hulk or anything, but just a little tug. And if you see ground movement, that means it's too loose. And the reason we want to do that is because if we have too much aeration in there, that also leaves room for water, and that could cause some pooling and flooding in that hole, and that can deteriorate the root. So we want to avoid that as much as possible. Always water in your new plants. When you're transplanting plants, they're a bit in shock. So always water them in, give them a nice little home, and waters like their nutrients when they move in. So water them in. Mulching and fertilizing. So I definitely encourage mulching around if you're going to do the springtime, just because in the springtime we do get a beautiful amount of rain, hopefully a little bit. But then we're going into summer where our temperatures rise, and having a little bit of mulch around the base of your plant will help that retention of water in the soil, and you'll lose less to evaporation. So having a nice little mulch around it is good. In the fall, less so, but you definitely want to maybe think about how much water you're able to retain within your soil if you want to consider mulching. And that's something you can definitely ask your nursery experts as well. Fertilizing is going to vary plant by plant. Some respond to it really well, some don't. So I really encourage you to look at that. And I would also encourage you to look at your soil composition before you look at fertilizing, because sometimes if you put too many nutrients, it kind of throws the balance off everything. So definitely look into that. Other thing I wanted to say about fertilizing is escaping me, but maybe it'll come back. Yes, we'll come back to it maybe. Okay. So we've started planting. We've done all of our homework. We've picked out our plant list. We're ready to go. I'm going to transition now into the plant portion. So these are all the plants that we have available on our tree sale. This is our Drummond willow. This is Salix drummadina. That is the only Latin time I'm going to say it, because I sound like a dog with peanut butter when I try to speak my Latin. But the Drummond willow is a beautiful riparian tree. It loves stream sides, moist meadows. This is one of the trees that if you have a really high up water table, it's going to thrive because it loves to be in that water zone. It prefers moist, well-drained soils and is pretty well adapted to different textured soils as well. It ranges in height from about 6 feet to 20 feet. So it's a pretty tall tree. It has long, beautiful lancet shape leaves. So just those nice little thin oval shape leaves. They have a green kind of silver tint to them. And one way to tell them apart from our other willows, because they do all look a little similar, is that they have a woolly underside. So they have nice little white hairs underneath the bottom. They develop catkins in the spring, which is their flowers. And I believe they drop every fall. So growth and care tips for this. This one is, it needs to be in water. It needs to be watered in the beginning at least twice a week. Yeah, water is pretty important to this guy. Prefers full sun, so about 6 hours of sun. And the great thing about this tree is that it pays you back. So once you get it established, you can prune it and you can propagate other trees from those cuttings. So simply, I usually say you don't want to do anything less than about 2 to 3 inch in diameter, and you can kind of just stick it right in the ground and it'll develop roots from its cutting. So it pays you back. The coyote willow is very similar to our Drummond willow. It also prefers those stream sides, those wetlands. It can grow in a variety of different soils. This one's a bit shorter, so we have about 3 feet to 15 feet. This one has a lot thinner leaves than our Drummond, and its catkins are a bit bigger and they're more yellow than the other one. But they also develop in spring. They prefer full sun. And kind of just as I move forward, when I say full sun, I am referencing anything that's 6 hours and more. So yeah, drought tolerant. So a lot of these plants that I'm going to show you are drought tolerant, but I just want to emphasize that when it's in its early growth periods, you don't want to just let it go on its own. You need to water it. You need to pay attention to it. Usually after the 3rd year, they're pretty good on their own. They can regulate their own water intake. So they can root freely from cuttings, just like the Drummond. You want to plant these usually during November and February. So the willows prefer a fall planting. So just because they like that extra water, and then they like going into the winter time. And like I said, water table plays a big factor in this. Fun fact, this is a, I guess it says shrub on there, but it can be a shrub, found at most Native American inhabited areas due to it being the most commonly used material for basket weaving. So very important plant for the Native American uses and heritage and history. So red osier dogwood, this is going to be kind of our last one of really water focused shrubs. This guy loves swamps, wetlands, and stream sides. So he grows to about a mature height of 10 foot to 15 foot. It is most known for its gorgeous red stems in the winter. You guys have probably seen it if you're driving back and forth from Moscow to Pullman on the Bill Chipman Trail. Beautiful shrub. It grows white flowers and berries that bloom in the spring. They have opposite leaves, so leaves that grow parallel to one another, and they're dark green on top with some hairs underneath. These guys are not drought tolerant. So when the willows are more established, they can be better about not being watered, but this guy needs constant access to water. So put it in an area where it is pretty saturated. Likes full sun, and it responds well to regular pruning. You should definitely prune this guy. He gets to be pretty bushy, so pruning is nice, and then it responds well because it shoots out new buds. So another fun fact is pioneers used to use this young bark as a tobacco substitute. Sorry, when I was doing research, I just found all these fun facts, and so I thought I'd just throw them in. But yeah, pretty cool. Okay. Pacific 9 bark. So these ones are still a bit more water focused, but they have different preferences, or they have different tolerance levels. So this guy prefers stream banks, swampy areas, open moist forests, and prefers well-drained soils. This is mostly distinguishable by its reddish brown papery bark. You can pull off individual strips. It comes with alternative leaves, and it has beautiful white flowers that develop in the spring. This is a shade tolerant plant. It does prefer partial shade, but it can handle full sun. So if you're looking for a shrub that works in shade, that one's good. It has a low drought tolerance, so water daily in its first years of growth. then once it's established, it does better. This is also a fall-based planting, so definitely try to focus your time in planting this one in the fall. Okay, woods rose. I'm sorry I'm going through these fast, but I swear I want to get to the questions. Wood rose. So this one is another great understory shrub. It prefers grasslands, moist draws, hillsides, and open forests. Like I said, great understory plant. It prefers sandy loam and well-draining soils. It produces beautiful pink flowers in May throughout July, and these really beautiful rose hips in the fall. So just a really gorgeous shrub throughout the year. It's pretty small, so 3 feet to 6 feet. So it's a great one to have in your garden. And I believe it does smell good. So it can grow in partial shade and full sun. You want to prune it back in the winter. And it's great for planting in newly disturbed sites. So along with those pioneer species that Shannon was talking about, this is another great one to kind of get started with as well. Chokecherry, beautiful tree, loves moist grasslands, open forests. It also needs that well-drained soil. It can handle quite a bit of soil textures, but clay is one that it has a little bit of an iffy relationship with. It grows up to about 15 feet tall. It blooms with white flowers in April and May, and it produces purple to black fruit. It has alternate leaves, and the best way to kind of distinguish this is nice kind of glands along the bark here. Now, the fruits are edible, but the leaf stems and seeds are toxic to human pets. So, you know, just always look up things before you eat them. But it's some people use it quite a bit, chokecherries. It prefers direct sunlight. It is shade intolerant, so no shade. Drought tolerant, you want to keep it wet, but nothing too saturated, and you want to prune it in the late winter. Blue elderberry, this is commonly found in stream banks and riverbanks. It's a water-loving plant. It can withstand flooding, so unlike our other water-loving plants, it can deal with a little bit of flooding water. It can grow pretty large. I think during my research, it came to about 23 feet was one that was recorded, but average is about 6 feet to 12 feet. I think Brad's on here, but Brad Jackal out at the Eggert farm, he has some really tall ones, which is pretty impressive. It flowers white from May to September, and it produces edible fruit only after cooked. I'm not encouraging anyone to eat berries. Look up before you do it. In July and October, and it has really slender pinnate leaves that are slightly spiked on the edge. These plants have very fragile root systems, so when you are moving them to the ground, you want to take especially care in transplanting them because they are very delicate and likely to more sensitive to disruption. They prefer full sun, but they're slightly shade tolerant, and you should water them every other week during their growth period. Okay, quaking aspen. This one has a wide variety of habitats. It is a great pioneer species to use on your property. It can grow anywhere from gravel slopes to stream banks to mountain slopes. It likes well-drained soils, but honestly, it can grow pretty much anywhere. It is distinguishable by its beautiful white bark. It can grow between about 15 to 50 feet tall, and it has these really gorgeous ovate heart-shaped leaves. It's not drought tolerant, so you want to keep the soil wet, but once it's established, you're pretty good. In the summer, you want to water at least once every week. Prefers full sun and minimal shade. And you definitely want to plant these away from foundations or septic systems just because they spread by their root system. So they send out shoots from their root systems. So anything that you feel like will be disturbed by the spreading of those root systems, you know, give it a good distance. Black hawthorn. This is a great bird habitat species. It prefers well-drained, moist, fine-textured soils. It grows in wetlands, open, moist meadows, and along stream banks. It can grow up to 35 feet tall, but it averages between 10 to 25. It has very large thorns on its branches, so please be cautious of that. It blooms in the spring with these beautiful clumps of white flowers, and it does produce edible berries that are red and black in color. It prefers full sun. It can handle some shade. Planting should happen in the spring for this guy. And it is drought tolerant after its 3 years, but it does require regular watering that first growth period. Oh, and I put planting during spring or fall, but it should be planting during spring. Okay, black cottonwood. This is a very tall species. It can grow from 40 feet to 100 feet tall. Its bark is beautiful, rough and scaly. It loves canyon bottoms, stream bank edges, meadows. I put alluvial sites. Alluvial is just old floodplain areas, so out like really fine sediment. And it does prefer moist areas. So this tree is probably best known for the summer snowfall. Its catkins will turn into those fuzzy white things that fall in the fall, and it looks like it's snowing outside. So this is sometimes not recommended for a garden or close to your house unless you want to deal with that. But it does prefer full sunlight. It's very shade intolerant, low drought tolerance, and high flood tolerance. So it's a very good hardy species. And this one also can propagate from cuttings. Okay, Western white pine. Getting into our conifers. So these are usually found between our moist valleys to open dry sites. It prefers a temperate climate and well-drained soils. These are our soft pines. So we have hard pines and soft pines, and usually the difference is the needle bunches. So this is in a bundle of 5. They have soft cones. It kind of looks like they're dotted with white resin on the outside, but their cones are also soft. They have no spikes on them, so that's nice. And it can range in height from 90 feet to 150 feet. So very large tree. It is drought tolerant. It prefers full sun. You want to avoid planting it near patios, cars, and houses just because in warm weather, its cones face downwards and they can drop pitch onto what's underneath it. So try to avoid that. Next is our Western larch, which is just a stunning tree because it is our only deciduous conifer that we're selling this year. So it loses its needles in the winter, but it transitions from this beautiful green color to a yellow-orange color in the fall. It prefers moist, cool climates with deep, well-drained soils of various textures. It prefers full sun. It is shade intolerant. It likes north or east facing exposures. You want to avoid southern exposure just because the heat really bothers it. It likes sun, but it doesn't like heat. So yeah, that's one thing to remember. This is a fall plant, and you can prune it in the winter as well. Okay, Western red cedar. This is a tree that prefers to be in shady and cool, moist habitats. It likes stream banks. It likes to be in mixed conifer stands. So some of the other ones like to be in groups with each other, but this one can intermingle, which is nice. It prefers well-drained soils. Mature heights can reach up to 230 feet tall, so just be aware of that. Averages between about 100 to 150 feet. The bark is a beautiful deep red color. It's well known for its durability and water resistance. It was often used in Native American history and heritage due to its flexibility and durability. Its leaves are flat. So unlike our pines, they're not spiky. They kind of lay flat and fan out. And they develop small pollen cones in autumn. They do develop a lot of pollen, so that's also something to keep in mind. It is not drought tolerant. It needs a decent amount of water, and it prefers partial sun, but is shade tolerant. Okay, I think we have two more. Ponderosa pine. Here we go. It prefers well-drained, sandy, loamy soil. This is probably our most commonly seen pine that we have out here. It loves dry mountain slopes with a southern exposure, so it loves heat, loves sun. Yeah, it's a great one. Thick red-orange bark is a huge distinguisher for it. So it has kind of like a puzzle-like structure. And because their bark is so thick, it's also fire resistant, which is great. It's one of our hard pines. So their pines are in bundles of 3. It can grow to be over 200 feet tall, but averages between about 60 to 125 feet. And the cones tend to cluster at the tip of the branches. You can plant this one during fall or spring. It loves full sun, like I said, drought tolerance once it's established. Prune it during late winter. And due to its large taproot, even during its first couple years, you really want to avoid pot planting. So you want to get these guys in the ground as quickly as possible. Fun fact, their bark smells like vanilla or butterscotch. So it depends on what your nose is like. But yeah, maybe next time you see a ponderosa pine, you can just go and give it a sniff. Okay, grand fir. This grows in stream bottoms, valleys, and mountainous slopes. It's well adapted to a diverse amount of soils. This one also prefers the alluvial soil, so the floodplain, old floodplain areas that are moist but well drained. The bark is a smooth and gray. These are often what we call our Christmas trees, what you can buy at the Christmas tree farm. So you guys are probably pretty familiar with it. Needles are often flat and waxy. The seed cones are closed in appearance and stand upwards, which is really unique. And then mature heights can reach up to about 250 feet tall. So very large trees. It is shade tolerant, but it grows slower in the shade. So it does prefer full sun in the beginning. Watering should happen every 1 to 2 weeks just to keep that soil moist. And you want to prune it in the late winter and plant in the spring or fall. Okay, that was really fast. But last couple ones, general tips and tricks. Start small. Start with one area, and then once you get that one established or you feel good about it, move on to another area. Have patience, start small. Trees should be planted about 10 to 12 feet apart, just to allow their root systems to develop and grow. Shrubs should be planted about 5 to 8 feet apart, just to create a nice little bundle. Local nurseries that we love. This isn't an exhaustive list, but these are the ones that came to my head. Plants of the Wild, Wildlife Habitat and Nursery, the Pitkin Nursery at University of Idaho, PCI, and then of course Rose Creek Seed. We are by no means the absolute expert in plants, but there are tons of people here on the Palouse that can fill in any gaps that we missed. And some of those organizations are the Palouse Prairie Foundation, the Master Gardeners Program, Phoenix Conservancy, White Pine Native Plant Society, the Palouse Land Trust in your local conservation district. There's tons of others and that have amazing resources. So I definitely encourage you, once you start this process, to reach out to an organization that you're familiar with. Okay, thank you. Sorry it went long.